So, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's session. I'm Sean Gibb. I'm the Events and Marketing Manager at Pro Manchester, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Wondering About the Practical Implementation of Improving Diversity, Equality and Inclusion in Your Organisation's Culture and Strategy, hosted by Beever and Struthers. Following today's session, I'll send out a post-event email which will contain any post-event collateral and also links to where you can find out about other Pro Manchester events and the Pro Manchester EDI committee. Just a few points of housekeeping. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded. Feel free to use the chat function to ask questions, make any comments, observations, and these will be reviewed and answered as we go along. Please keep your microphones on mute just for the time being, but there will be an opportunity to come off mute. The transcription feature is enabled on this session, so you have the ability from your side to either enable that or disable that, depending on your personal preferences. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Sue Hutchinson, Partner and Head of Charities Sector at Beever and Struthers.
Oh, thank you, Sean. Welcome, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us on this session. And I think just to set a little bit of a scene as to why we're here today and hosting this session in terms of, our work with our clients across many sectors, has very much brought to the forefront, support and knowledge and awareness of the journey that we're all on in society with regards to equality, diversity and inclusion. And actually what a lot of our clients are saying to us are, what are others doing? How are others, making this happen, making changes happen? How are others even starting to think about it? So we recognize that many different organizations are on a different place on this journey. But I think very much what we thought then was that, if we could find some good colleagues who could come and join us and have some discussions about this, then what we'd love to do is bring some of that experience and some others' journeys to the table today to talk to you and hopefully help you on your journey, wherever that may be, with regards to your strategy and embedding and actions around equality, diversity, inclusion. So from my perspective, today is about, and what we do want, hopefully you are wondering, and that's why you're here, but we do want to bring out some of those practicalities. So we're not going into any political campaigns. Obviously we all, it sits at the heart of all of us in terms of the change that needs to happen. But in terms of the panelists that we have around the table, they are excellent. They've been doing things. I'm going to allow them to talk to you about their journeys and their insights. So they're going to give you a few minutes in terms of each of their journeys and some of the things they've been focusing on, but very much we do want the discussions to revolve today around what the practicalities are, and hopefully you'll get some takeaways from that. I've also got my colleague Helen Armstrong on the call as well, who is fundamental in terms of our work at Beever and Struthers with clients regarding this topic in her role as a risk and assurance advisor. And so helping clients in terms of looking at their processes and strategies around it. And she'll be talking to us as well. And I have my marketing colleagues in the background, led by Geraldine Finn as well, who'll be taking lots of things on board and hopefully making sure that as we get to the end of today, any of the key messages and the key tips, then we can bring them together and actually share them with you in some post-session feedback. So without much further ado, I'm just going to go around the panelists one by one, and they're going to introduce themselves and, as I said, talk about their journey so far. As Sean said, it's very much, we do have some questions amongst ourselves, just to get, to get the conversation flowing. Those of you who've joined sessions like this with us before, we do make it conversational between ourselves and the panelists. Obviously, as Sean said, if you have any questions or any comments you'd like to make them in the chat. If there are last time on one of these sessions, there were so many that I'm not sure we got to all of them, but we'll try and get to all of them, or maybe there's a theme coming out that we can pull together. So please do feel free to use that chat function. So firstly, I'm going to go to Grenville Page. Grenville, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. Good afternoon, everybody, and it's absolutely fantastic to see so many here on this extremely important subject matter. And I think I'm a non-executive across health, housing, social care, and charities, and I do consultancy work. So I work with a wide range of organisations. But I'll certainly start off by just saying I am on my own personal journey here of learning, listening, asking questions, increasingly challenging and taking action and getting involved in things like today's event. I've also become involved in Struthers North West Council subgroup for EDI. So I'm very much on a learning journey. But my starting point was, I suppose, you know, I was like many white people, many of my white colleagues who I suspect took a view in the past that, you know, I treat people with respect, I don't exclude people, you know, I'm friendly, I don't judge, I don't discriminate. And I took an interest in EDI discussions when they came up at work. But at the beginning of last year, and certainly prompted by COVID and the significant discussions that started to take place about inequalities and the impact of COVID on more diverse communities, I started to take a much more deeper interest in the whole issue about EDI and health inequalities. And I attended a masterclass and got involved in some deeper discussions in the organisations that I work with people from more diverse backgrounds and characteristics. And I attended other learning and training events. And I think I very quickly realised that my previous approach and what I thought I was doing just actually wasn't good enough. And since then, I've started to really get a better understanding of people's lived experiences and the whole issue of unconscious bias that I think we all have. And certainly with myself, you know, that white privilege that you just take for granted and sometimes you don't think too deeply about. So on the back of these various training events and masterclasses and sort of an increasing awareness, I made a pledge to myself that I would, and this came out of one of the masterclasses, that I would own my white privilege, but I'd own it in a way that I'd try to use it for the greater good. And since then, I've become a lot more engaged on lots of issues. And I've certainly been putting my head above the parapet in certain board meetings and really challenging organisations and asking questions about, are we really doing enough about these issues around EDI? So as I said, that's all I wanted to say, but you know, I'm on my personal journey and I think I'm still at the very beginning of it. But again, hopefully this session will inform me as well in terms of going forward and the challenges and questions and how I use my energies. So that's all I want to say at this stage, Sue.
Thank you, Grenville. And it is interesting. I think if we all admitted it, we're all on a personal journey with this as well as, you know, trying to help our organisations that we work with embed and take some lead in terms of change. Sean Miller, can I come to you next, please?
Thank you, Sue, and afternoon, everybody, and it's great to be here. My name is Shamila Carr. I'm the Director of Workforce, OD and Inclusion for Manchester Health and Care Commissioning. And for those who don't know what MHCC is, it's an organisation, a health organisation, clinical commissioning group in a partnership with Manchester City Council. And I think I'm going to just very briefly, because I'd love to get into an interactive kind of discussion, the three aspects in terms of my journey. So the first is, you know, my own lived experience. The second is, you know, how and what we're doing to support workforce within the health and care sector. And the third, which Grenville has touched on, is COVID and what that's, how it's shone a light on the huge inequality that we have in society. And I'm obviously based in Manchester, and we have some very deep-rooted inequalities in our city in Manchester. It's a fabulous, great city to work, to live and work in, but there are some real challenges. So in terms of my journey, I'm originally from India, so I'm an immigrant to this country, been in the UK now for 25 years. I come, with my own identity, being a woman, being a gay woman, being of mixed heritage. So that with it comes my lived experience. I've been passionate about EDI for as long as I can remember. And I've worked predominantly in the in the public sector, but working around culture change, people development and inclusion, and understanding how that all fits together as we try and change cultures in the workplace. And there are some practical things that I'd like to just touch on in terms of what we've done in Manchester Health and Care Commissioning around the workforce, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later on around our 10-point talent plan, which is a very practical tool that we've introduced to increase workforce representation. And then the second element is around COVID and the disproportionality that COVID has exposed within different communities. So, so there's some shocking statistics in terms of the impact that COVID has had, where in terms of deprivation, in terms of people of colour or communities that experience racial inequality, disabled people, and also the impact that it's had on the health and care workforce as a whole. So, in terms of my journey, our challenges, these are sorts of things that we are grappling with at the moment. And, inclusion and how we think about inclusion and addressing inequalities is at the core of what I do. And I'd love to be able to have a further conversation about it with yourselves later. Thank you.
Thanks, Shamila. And I think, yeah, you've definitely touched on, this is about, the workforce, the people that we work with, but also, the wider community and how, and I guess looking at it from both of those aspects and looking at what we do and some of those practical, the point that yours is a 10-point plan. I've read about 5- and 6-point plans. So really interesting to hear a little bit more about that later. Thank you. If I move over to Abdul now.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Really nice to be here, and it's a really interesting subject for me to kind of have a discussion about. So I'll just touch upon my personal sort of area, and also just from an organisational perspective where we are with our own journey. So I am the Director of Development for Golden Lane Housing, which is a specialist social housing provider for people with learning disabilities. So we exclusively work with to rehouse people who are in the community but might not be in the right settings, who are facing a lot of inequalities in their own home regardless of their background. Some are institutionalized in care homes, and some are in long-term hospitals. So from our organizational perspective.
Oh.
So I think we've lost Abdul there.
Oh dear, I was wondering if I'd just frozen on the screen. Okay, well, whilst we're waiting for him to come back, then Tara, are you okay to pick up the reins and just introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure, no problem at all. Good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to be here today. It's really excited to kind of take part in the conversations that we're having as well on a obviously really important topic. I am the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Specialist at Great Places Housing Group. I have been working in the social housing sector since about 2006. Again, mainly specialising in equalities, but I've also got a background in housing governance. In terms of kind of my journey and kind of what brought me here today as well, a little bit like Shamila, I think my background in terms of where my own personal experiences and how I grew up really got me interested in equality, diversity and inclusion, and really thinking about the kind of importance of that. So as a gay woman growing up in Northern Ireland, I was all too aware from a very young age around issues of kind of religious intolerance, discrimination, particularly around sexuality as well, and growing up coming to terms with that my own self and thinking about how that would impact my life and on my life chances and opportunities. So really coming into the kind of equalities area with my own personal experiences, but also my own beliefs around kind of how important that is, how we must kind of ensure that, our society is inclusive. It is thinking about the needs of everyone, and that we are kind of really addressing those kind of societal barriers really that are stopping people from kind of being the best version of themselves. In terms of my recent journey, my organisation, I came from an organisation prior called Equity Housing Group, and we decided to merge with Great Places in March 2020, which was of course, an interesting time to bring two organisations together. We did not see what was going to come next. But again, and my role within that was to develop a new equality and diversity inclusion strategy for the newly merged organisation. So really, I've spent the past year trying to work with your organisation in terms of creating that kind of culture of inclusion. You know, how do you bring a smaller organisation and a larger organisation together? Thinking about the workforce that you have, thinking about the communities that you serve, and really kind of drawing together, I guess, our past experiences, our strengths, and also identifying our weaknesses in terms of how we can really address and improve the way that we operate as an employer, and as well as a kind of a service provider. So it's been a really interesting journey. I'll be honest, at the start, it was like, oh my goodness, this is an enormous task to try and do without actually being able to see people in person. But actually, I've kind of really realized it's actually brought opportunities as well. We've really thought quite innovatively in terms of, you know, how we engage with people and how we look at things. And we've done a lot around creating those kind of spaces for people to kind of engage and talk. And I think during that time, I think it was something that actually people really welcomed. You know, it was a difficult time, obviously, for us all. But again, as an organisation, it really made us stop to think about how we are actually supporting and engaging with colleagues, how we're supporting our customers. And I know particularly during that time, you know, our customers really, we knew that the services that we were usually providing, we couldn't provide. We had to think about different ways of kind of giving them support. And we knew that we had some of the most vulnerable people in our society, you know, living in our homes. And we had a really important part to play in terms of, you know, helping them even to access, kind of thinking about basic requirements around food, around heat, around, you know, how they, you know, how their social isolation, have they got support networks? So we played a really kind of big role in that. And I think for me, that really brought home to the organisation and the business about what our role is in terms of supporting, you know, supporting our customers. And really just we had lots of opportunities to kind of talk with colleagues around the work that we do and the improvements that we can make. So I've really spent the last year trying to kind of create a lot of safe spaces for people to come and talk, to share their experiences, you know, to talk to us about their anxieties. And I think we've all been talking about anxiety quite a lot, haven't we, in the last year, and kind of well-being and how important that is. And I think to kind of provide those spaces for colleagues to come together and to be honest and to talk about their experiences has been really important. So in terms of my journey, I think in the last, I think since 2006 and working in the sector, I've seen some massive improvements in terms of how we address equality, diversity, inclusion. I think the social housing sector is really dedicated, and I think we can see the business benefits, but also continued inequalities and continued struggles. You know, I think, you know, I think for me, I think we were talking earlier today about how, you know, it's not a quick fix. You know, we don't have all the solutions to everything. It's an ongoing journey and an ongoing process. And I think events like today are really important because we just want to share our experiences. You know, this is what we do well. This is not what we don't do so well, you know, and bring people together to talk about that.
That's great. Thank you, Tara. I think, yeah, I think definitely that there are, you know, and as we look in on it as a business, Beever and Struthers, we look at the sectors and we can see lots of engagement in that housing sector that you are in. And I think for me, you know, I can see engagement through the care sector, but it's actually how do, I guess part of my questioning, and not a question for now, but maybe a question that you can all think about in terms of answering, is how do we support? We've talked about public sector, that's what we're sort of labeling that as, but then how do we support the private sector in their ambition with this as well, and their need for change, and in finding those opportunities too. Now I think Abdul has come back.
Hi. Sorry,
Go Abdul.
I'm not sure where I got lost. I think my signal went off. So I was talking away without realizing my screen froze. So I'm not sure how much of that you caught up there, and I can pick up from
I think it was quite early on, Abdul. So I think you'd introduced yourself in Golden Lane Housing, and then we sort of lost you then. So yeah.
Okay, sorry, that's fine. Yeah, I'll pick it up from just very quickly, conscious of time, that I'm looking at it from two angles. I know others have spoke about the personal journey and the organizational journey. I think from a personal journey, obviously coming from an ethnic minority background, I faced some challenges. Some experiences really good, and others weren't so great. So I think a lot of where my personal journey is born by what's worked well for me, and that's why I really want to reflect on other people, in a sense of give them that right type of platform and opportunity to kind of, maybe take advantage of the way I've kind of progressed through my career and some of the personal experiences that I've had as well. I think from an organizational perspective, we've always tackled inequality through our values. We're a very values-driven organization. We primarily work with people with learning disabilities, and that in itself has a lot of inequalities. Historically, people with learning disabilities were put into institutional settings, did not have any rights, did not have a say in terms of where they live, who they live with. And organizations like ourselves, following government policy and local authority structure changes, allow people back into the community, have rights and tenancies. And I think from a values-driven perspective, that's been born into the organization from our inception, in a sense. And I think, through COVID, it allows us to kind of really reflect on where we are in that journey. And I think there's nothing, I don't think we should be ashamed to acknowledge that maybe we're doing a great piece of work, but we're still, the level of understanding around EDI is not great through the organization. And then we felt, engaging with our staff, particularly through COVID, we had to do it very differently, kind of really brought out the fact that, yes, we are good at what we do, but the level of understanding, the level of strategy and other things that we really need to drive through are not necessarily matured as we thought they were. And that isn't to say that we're doing anything wrong. It's more around how we drive the future, in a sense. And I think we felt that if we're going to do that, rightly so, we have to drive that from top down. So, we've got organizations who specialize in EDI to come in and really kind of train our senior leadership team to kind of really understand some of the challenges and how we meet that, and not be afraid to be challenging as well. And I think, what we've certainly seen is that there's some anxiety with our staff, particularly from BME backgrounds around world events, where we've seen the issues in America last year. People had a lot of anxiety, and we felt we had to tackle that, them conversations, because people felt vulnerable without going into the political side of it. So it's more about addressing their own anxiety. And I think these kind of conversation leaders led to where we are today. So we are at very early part of our journey, but we want to be is in a very comfortable position. For us, it's not about a box ticking exercise that we've done this. For us, it's about integrating that into our values. We're a growing organization, and we're conscious that we're having a lot of staff come in to the organization now and in the future, and we don't really want to lose that value. So I think we are trying to put a strategy in place that allows people to have that value top down, all the way down to at front facing from a staff or tenant perspective. And the other piece of work we're just doing quickly is around our tenants. We recognize some part of the society is very underrepresented in supported housing, particularly accessing supported housing. People from BME backgrounds or all kind of backgrounds have learning disabilities within their own sort of population. And what we're finding sometimes is that there's a need out there, there's a demand out there, but people are not necessarily accessing. And I think, in a lot of local authorities, unfortunately, there'll be this brush aside to say, well, that's a cultural issue, or there is an element of truth in that. But I guess what we're saying as a sector, we're not reaching out to people. We're not reaching out to the benefits that we could bring in. And that's going to be part of our journey, to reach out to our tenants. We got a good representation in terms of our tenant sort of portfolio around BME, but we do think we can improve on that. And I think for us, we're not going to change the world ourselves. It's going to be a long journey, but it's almost educating the wider world out there. And also, local authorities have to play a part in it, because they're in control of some of these referrals. So we're trying to have that collective approach to address some of these gaps.
Yeah, and I think, thanks, Abdul. I think it is very much, and I think that's what we've discussed along the way, getting ready for today, isn't it? This is, we're all probably at quite a start of the journey, but I think that's where we are as a society. And there's many barriers, and I think some of them, and you've just been talking about, it's interesting you talk about strategy and leadership. There's some statistics out there and representation, that even in the leadership world, the representation of those disadvantaged and those in the minorities just isn't there. And how do we encourage that? And it's interesting to hear that, you have, more engagement and interaction with your tenants in terms of that representation, but you feel that there's more that you need to do as an organisation. And it is interesting that you talk about that top-down approach, actually, because that probably takes me back, if it's all right, to Grenville, because I think Grenville, in your various NED roles, I guess that's where your positioning is with this. And what can you give us in terms of, I guess, some tips? And you've talked to us about your personal tips, and that's an interesting journey. I like the personal pledge, actually. I really do like that. But I guess from a board perspective, you know, what are you seeing, or what have you been involved in, or what would you like to see more of at that leadership level?
I think for me, it's the starting to ask those questions. So in one board I was in, we were talking about a well-being audit that had been undertaken, and the member of staff was reporting about that. And it was an organisation that I'd recently joined. And I just asked a simple question about, you know, where do we stand on EDI and what are we actually doing? And it was just a genuine question because I didn't know. But that simple challenge actually then did drive a discussion and an appreciation, really, because I shared some of the things I'd been picking up, that actually, as an organisation, we hadn't done enough. And I think that is going to now spark a greater focus and some further action. So for me, it's just asking those simple questions. And in another board organisation, you know, when I raised this, and this was on the back of me sort of sharing my own pledge about taking ownership of my white privilege and using it for greater effect, and really trying to make sure that we understand lived experiences, because there's no way that I have those lived experiences. And I said, look round the boardroom table. We are all of a certain age and a certain colour. And again, I think that has sparked people thinking at a deeper level than this. So for me at the moment, it's just doing what I can and asking those challenging questions, or simple questions really, to spark a discussion.
I think very much, I guess what you're saying is it needs to be on the agenda during the normal agenda. I think it is interesting in the sectors that I work in. So I work in the not-for-profit sector. We often find things like the values that Abdul was talking about, you know, embedded within even the agendas, you know, the handwritten agendas, you know, where does this matter in terms of our strategy and our values? Value for money being a typical one in the housing sector. But I guess, yeah, how does this then embed itself into those agendas? And as you say, asking and being honest and asking the questions. And I just wonder, Abdul, you were talking about, you know, developing your strategy. How have you gone about that? Could you?
I started similar to others have spoke about. It started about a board level. I think, you know, we've asked that question in a sense, and I think sometimes you can be quite complacent about what you're doing, and you know, you think you're doing things well until you start to do a deep dive into, okay, are we doing it well enough, in a sense? And I think that's where the conversation started. It's almost our board asking us what our representation around our staffing was from different backgrounds and our tenants wise. And I think the question started around, okay, how can we do better? And I think the way we've kind of looked at our strategy, we've got a people strategy in terms of, look, we work in a very diverse environment. Our head office is in the middle of Manchester as a big, you know, diverse population, and are we represented enough to do that? I guess our strategy, in a sense, is to kind of really pin down in terms of how do we encourage more people within that group to apply for it. There's certainly talent is not a lack of talent, in a sense that every sort of community has the pool of talents. Is I think, how do we make social housing attractable to others that may not be aware of it? So I think there's that kind of campaign going out there. And for us, ultimately, it's about the right person for the right job. It's not just about, you know, getting that number of application and pointing that job to kind of meet that number. For us, it's about getting the right talent, and so we don't want to compromise on that. From a tenant perspective, I guess what we're saying, our strategy has always been about what's been done externally to kind of increase the level of engagement from other backgrounds into social housing, particularly our sort of sector, I would almost say we're a subsector within social housing, because we don't do general needs housing property. So we're dependent on adult social care, referring 100% of our tenants into our services. And what are they doing? And I think what we've done, in particular in my directorate, in the development side of it, we've almost built into our strategy that how do we engage with local authorities to get a better output from people in BME community. So we are looking at doing some pilots in some local authorities where it has a BME population. So for example, in Oldham, in Greater Manchester, is one of our target areas. We know from our own data that there's a lot of people that access adult social care, but not necessarily supported housing. And I think it's almost looking at what is the environmental changes. So in a sense, people maybe from BME backgrounds have almost looked after their own family members, and we know environment is changing. Particularly females from the BME background are more career-minded than in the past, where in the past there was an expectation that they look after family members. And we got people working, so they're not necessarily able to manage that. So we are looking at the environmental factors as well, and what happens to their relatives. And I think one of the anxieties that we find from family members from all background is parents are aging, and I think their biggest concern is, where do my children go after, when I get frail, or when they pass away. And I think what we've done is asked local authorities, almost challenge them into what your strategy around attracting more people from BME. And I think what we're saying is, because there's a lack of engagement, in all fairness, with some local authorities, we will develop that strategy. And so I think we're almost engaging with organizations that focus on engagement with BME populations, and almost trying to get our message out there. There are some aspects of cultural barriers that disadvantages people to come into supported living. And we're trying to really understand that. And as I said, it's quite early in our journey. It's not going to be an overfit. Some of it is in our control. Some of it is in control of others. So we're really trying to understand that. So our strategy at this stage, in a sense, is almost that engagement, trying to understand the external environment. And I think what we're almost doing is we use our own capital program to develop a lot of our schemes. And what we tend to do is we use investors that are in the market that want to have a massive social impact in this sector, and almost engaging with them to say, okay, what can we do differently to attract people from different backgrounds into the new services that we develop. We certainly don't want to create a ghetto of people that are from certain background. That's not what we're trying to do. Is we're trying to develop schemes that are attractive to everybody, but also meet some of these barriers that people face not to come into our services. So for us, it's about our first part of our phase is always going to be trying to engage, understand, and develop our service to tailor around that. And we're trying to do that with support. We don't think we can do it alone. So we're trying to engage and develop that strategy in our 10-year business plan for delivery.
Brilliant. That was that was really helpful, because I think engagement is definitely coming through as a theme, and understanding. And I think it's that collaboration piece as well. It's you can't just go at this on your own, can you? You need to work with other stakeholders and other key stakeholders. But the other aspect that I found quite interesting about what you just said was that focus, isn't it? You're focusing, and I think from my perspective, in terms of a practicality, if we're embarking on something that sounds quite big and quite large in terms of a strategy, then actually, where are we going to focus our time and attention? But that bit about, understanding, I guess, your tenants, understanding even your stakeholders. As you said, the local government authority does have an EDI policy and strategy itself, doesn't it, across the country? But it's interesting to hear that you're saying that possibly not necessarily all engaged with it in the same way. I wonder at this point if my colleague Helen wouldn't mind, because she's got experience of sort of, I guess, going through that kind of strategy aspect with our clients. So Helen, have you got anything that you could comment on at this point?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. I think you've just summed up quite nicely. I think that when we're working in this area with our clients, we are seeing that clients are facing the same sort of difficulties in some cases about how to get started into making a difference in this space. And I think some of it is driven by that engagement piece. There is a lack of data within the organisations to understand the staff structure. So from that very the starting point is, have we got a diverse staff culture, but also the diversity of the customer base, be that a social housing customer base or a private sector customer base. And I think that what we're finding is that there is a little bit of a fear factor around that engagement side, and how to actually talk to people to say, well, what are the barriers for you accessing our services, as Abdul's just talked about, or for purchasing our product and engaging with our customers. So I would be interested in hearing from the panelists about how you tackle that, whether it's from a commercial perspective about how do different groups and people with different characteristics perceive your brand, and does that prevent access, and how do you overcome that and engage that with them? And I know all of the panelists have talked about engagement and how they've gone about doing that. So I think there might be some interesting takeaways for some of the people on the call about, yeah, how to get started on that.
How to get started. So Sean Miller, would you like to come in at this point and tell us how any tips and hints and experience you can share?
Yeah, so if I take two aspects really, one is workforce, and we all employ people, and we want to. So for our organisation, we are an organisation that serves the City of Manchester, and therefore our workforce needs to look like the City of Manchester. And we did some real hard we took a hard look at, what does our workforce actually look like? Going back to Helen's point around data, we were lucky that we had systems in place that could we could analyze the data. So as a tip to organizations, I'd say even as a basic level, you need to understand your data, because what gets measured gets done. So that's something that's really important. And then, we looked at our data, and then we said we embarked on something called a 10-point talent plan, which had, what our aspirational targets would be for the next 5 years in terms of our workforce. So we looked at gender, we looked at ethnicity, we looked at disability, and we looked at LGB status. We don't have, we have to do more work around trans awareness in our organization. We're still on quite a steep learning curve as an organization. But we looked at where are we now, and where do we want to be in 5 years' time, and what's the demographic of Manchester is going to look like in 5 years' time. So in terms of gender, the health sector is predominantly female and a lot of women. However, that changes as you start to look up the kind of up the ladder. But we said, okay, we've got 60, sort of a 70-30 split. We'll keep a watching brief on that. On ethnicity, Manchester's population is around 40 to 50%. We'll know when the census come out in terms of what the data is. Our data was telling us that it was at that time in 2019 when we embarked on this, it was around 18%. So we were nowhere near where we needed to be. So our trajectory for the 5 years, we want to get to 40%. Disability, again, we have a real challenge in terms of staff who will declare a disability, because that goes back to culture and inclusion and a fear of disclosing one's disability, particularly if it's related to mental health. However, we knew that about 5% of our staff identified as being disabled, but we also had a larger non-disclosure element to it. And then in terms of LGB staff, it was in 2019 our data was telling us we had about 5% of our staff who identified as LGB. So what was our trajectory is going to be, in 5 years' time. So on disabilities, we said we want to hit a 20% target because that's the kind of, the kind of statistics you'd see in terms of disabled people in the workforce. And around LGB, we wanted to hit a 10% target. And so we introduced something called a 10-point talent plan. And basically it's quite a simple kind of series of steps that we took to make our recruitment and selection process much more inclusive. So, fair inclusive training for all managers, that was mandated. And it's not just a one-off, it's a continuous kind of process that we go through. Improving how we do equality analysis and really analyzing our data on a quarterly basis to see, where are we on that trajectory. Looking at, so we have said all panels have to be diverse. So you can't have a panel of all white men, as an example. It has to be, a mixture of gender, ethnicity, etc. review our job descriptions and person specifications, because that's really important. You know, I've seen some job descriptions and you think there's no such, you have to be superhuman to achieve all those criteria. So let's look at it, moving much more to a competency and a values-based approach to how we want to recruit. Advertising, where are we looking for people, not just on NHS jobs? Are we going out to our communities? Are we talking to our communities about working within the health sector? Pre-recruitment, doing kind of open recruitment events, talking to people within the community, but also making sure that recruitment panels were doing a lot of prep before they go into that kind of next stage. Because I think, you know, people have busy jobs and they think, oh, I've got to recruit for a post, you know, and I'll do it last minute. But I think people forget that, you know, this is a really important decision that you're making about an individual who's going to come into your organization. And would you do the same thing if it was a, you know, a financial decision that you were having to make? So let's put it on that par. Well-structured interviews are on competency and values-based, checks and balances, tracking. We're tracking constantly. And then we haven't quite got there yet because the pandemic hit. Was around recruitment champions across the organizations to promote the plan. And so in terms of our trajectory, we're kind of on course. In terms of gender, as I said, we're kind of a 70-30 split. Ethnicity, we're on trajectory. 28% of our workforce identify as now being from an ethnic minority background. Disability, we're just under 8%. And on LGB, we're just, you know, we've stayed static around 5%. So we've got, you know, we've got work to do, but we did, you know, and we had a big debate in our organization. Oh, we can't have quotas. We're not talking about quotas. We're talking about aspirational targets. And, you know, you have to work towards something. And within the health sector, we get measured on all sorts of things. So why aren't we measuring our workforce? And why aren't we holding people to account in terms of reaching those targets? So it was signed off at our kind of executive team, and the board also get you know, regular updates on where we are. So that leadership buy-in is absolutely critical. So that's the workforce example. On an engagement perspective, again, you know, COVID has really kind of made us rethink how are we engaging with our communities, and I don't think we do it very well. I think we consult, we don't engage, and we don't involve. So on the back of COVID last year, we set up something called a COVID Health Equity Group that is chaired by myself and my colleague who's a public health consultant. And the focus of that was really to look at those communities who had been hardest hit by COVID. But there was a more important kind of role to that. It's about minimizing the risk of transmission and trying to stop people dying. And that was the driver for that. So we set up what we call sounding boards. From within our Black African, Black Caribbean community. We have a disabled people's engagement group, and we also have an inclusion health engagement group that brings in people who identify as asylum seekers, refugees, gypsy traveller, and also sex workers. And we use those groups as our kind of critical friend to pass information through, but also tell us what the communities are telling them. Because the trust we have, you know, we know this, but trust is a major issue in terms of communities, their trust in public authorities. People tend to trust the NHS more, but I think that recently there's been that's dipped. And we've used the data again very effectively to drive some of our messaging, and it's been particularly helpful as we've tried to roll out the vaccination programme. So, you know, we're on that journey in terms of engagement, but we are trying to do it differently and really listen, not tell. And I think that's the key shift in terms of you really need to listen to what your communities are telling. And a simple example is we automatically think, you know, in Manchester, we have something like 200 different languages spoken. So we'll try and send information out in lots of different translated languages. Well, if people can't read and write, sending information out in translated languages isn't going to make a difference. So we've started to use much more pictorial forms of communication. So, you know, in trying to convey, you know, what are the kind of key symptoms of COVID, rather than do lots of text, try and communicate the messages differently, audio, visual, you know, so some simple hints and tips in terms of how to get some of those messages out to communities. So those are kind of two examples from a, you know, healthcare addressing inequalities perspective, but from a workforce perspective in terms of what we actually practically done on the ground.
Oh, thanks, Shamila. And some, you know, really interesting tips there, and interesting that links to what we've just been talking about, data as well. I think it sounds like, you know, you've grabbed your data and you're using that to inform and help and see whether you're on the right journey as well. And I just guess, I mean, I'm sat here just practically thinking, and there is a question in the chat, so I'll come back to it in a sec, but in terms of that, have you then as an organization put a lot of resource into this? Is that also something that's happened to make this happen, if that makes sense?
From the workforce perspective, obviously it's led by the HR team, and yes, we have brought in a EDI specialist to work with us on that, but we also kind of work collectively and in partnership with the council. On the COVID health equity side, yes, we have put additional resources into, because I don't think you can do effective engagement without the right resource. So, you know, we've had kind of funding through government in terms of the Champions Fund, but collectively as health and care systems, we also put resources in, both people and money, to kind of build this infrastructure on how we want to engage. And I've just seen somebody's put in the chat, you know, why do we not focus on age and other specific characteristics? It's not that we don't measure age and religion and belief and other characteristics, but we know that from a ethnicity perspective, from a disabilities perspective, those are the two areas we have some real disproportionality in terms of our workforce and how we provide services. And therefore, we made a decision to prioritize those, not to say that the other protected characters are not important. But I'm firmly of the belief I believe that if you get it right, you know, for race and disability, you will also get it right in other areas. But that's not to diminish, you know, but we felt as an organisation we had a real challenge around those two areas, and so we prioritised disability and ethnicity in this at the moment.
Oh, that's great. Thanks, Shamila. And I think, you know, just leading on from what you were answering in terms of, you know, that resource question. And I guess we've got an EDI specialist in the room, Tara, haven't we? Who, yeah, she's been doing that and been explaining what she's been doing. And I guess, Tara, just, you know, continuing with that, I guess, engagement piece, it was really interesting what Shamila had to say about consult and not engage. And I'm like, oh God. What's the difference? But I think you talked about local spaces, etc. earlier. So could you bring that to life for people?
Yeah, for me, I think it is that kind of key part of, you know, we talk about a diverse workforce, and I think we do have a diverse workforce. You know, we are quite representative of kind of the communities we serve in terms of different backgrounds and cultures, in terms of identities, in terms of age. Maybe not so much at leadership team, which is a challenge for us. But again, we might be diverse, but actually how inclusive are we? And how much do we actually understand about each other's life experiences, kind of the challenges that we face on a regular basis? So I think for us, one of the kind of key things that we wanted to do was create those environments where people felt safe to talk about their experiences, about their lived experiences of working in the organisation, and also, you know, outside of work as well, and how that impacted on our lives. So we created what we called them space to talk sessions. Basically, our integration program was themed around the space theme. So we thought space to talk sessions, and really it was informal sessions that we set up with colleagues. Our leadership team attended. We did them kind of in different themes. So again, we had a session following around kind of Black Lives Matter. We've had sessions around hidden disabilities. You know, we've had sessions around kind of LGBT inclusion. And again, we're encouraging colleagues to come along and talk about their lived experiences, you know, and how that kind of impacts on their, you know, how much they can feel like they can be themselves at work, and kind of the challenges that present like that. And some really interesting kind of feedback from some colleagues around, you know, that they do feel like they can't bring them whole selves into work. And that was, again, from some of our colleagues from minority ethnic backgrounds, feeling that they couldn't totally express their culture, couldn't totally be themselves. Also similarly from people from LGBT communities too, who felt that maybe they had to hide part of who they were in the workplace. Some interesting comments about that they felt that they had to change for their workplace culture rather than the culture trying to change in terms of their experiences, which I thought was interesting in terms of they felt that they had to fit in, but rather, you know, you're not thinking about the barriers to me. Some examples as well about kind of like microaggressions and things like that in the workplace. You know, we'd colleagues talking about, you know, with hidden disabilities, especially talking about, you know, they get a lift. You know, people are coming, oh, you're a bit lazy today. You know, those little kind of comments that people, you know, they don't kind of sit and think about, actually, why is that person taking the lift today, or why are they using disabled park? So again, it was more about kind of, well, how does it actually feel to work here? You know, does that make you, you know, feel included? Does that make you think that the organization's thinking about your needs? So we really kind of created those opportunities to kind of, for colleagues to really share with us how they felt, and it's resulted in some really kind of interesting initiatives. We had a session for carers, for example, thinking about their responsibilities around being a carer for parents, for children with disabilities, example, and how they kind of balance work with that. Again, obviously that was a challenge for a lot of people last year in COVID, kind of balancing looking after kids and work. But again, really thinking about the impacts of our working practices, and, you know, can we be a little bit more flexible? Can we think differently about our working hours, where we work from, in terms of supporting people who maybe have those kind of additional kind of responsibilities? And we've got like a monthly carers catch-up session now. People just drop in, have a coffee together virtually, you know, talk about their experiences, and it kind of feeds back to us then. So for me, really, it's kind of, it's enabling people to have that space to be honest and to talk about how actually it is, what it is like to work there. And again, for me, that is that kind of that sense of inclusion. You know, can you bring your true self to work? Can you be yourself? Are you holding anything back? And again, as organizations, creating those opportunities to have those conversations. And in terms of like the leadership team, you know, we did talk a little bit like Shamila about kind of representation. We have a predominantly white board and leadership team. Our colleagues have told us that they don't see themselves reflected at the leadership level. And for them, that's a challenge. You know, do you understand our lived experiences and what it's like to work here? And our board and our leadership team, you know, really took that on, and they said, yes, you know, we need to do something in terms of thinking about how representative we are. We've also set a target for our board leadership in terms of BME representation over the next 3 years. We've got that churn. We want to target, you know, communities, and to think about how, you know, what are the barriers to people to coming and being on our board and our leadership team. But we've also got our leadership team coming back and saying, actually, we want our colleagues to come and talk to us about their experiences. We're looking at reverse mentoring. So again, you know, you talk to me about what it's like to work here, what challenges you're facing. I'll give you some examples of how I've tackled, you know, challenges within my own kind of personal career journey. So really that kind of two-way process about learning from each other, and hopefully kind of bringing back to, you know, to those kind of strategic discussions around issues that kind of colleagues might be facing. We've had a lot of talk around hybrid working. I think a lot of organizations are now thinking about the offices and, you know, the benefits to that and possible kind of challenges. And I know for me as an EDI specialist, we're trying to create this culture of inclusion. But if more and more people are working from home, you know, how do you get those opportunities to have those kind of conversations over the, you know, having a brew at the coffee station, you know, those informal chances to kind of talk to people. So we were really thinking about, you know, making sure that if we are introducing hybrid working, it's brilliant to support people who are carers. You know, it's brilliant for single mothers, for single fathers, for people who are managing kids, you know, responsibilities. But again, the challenges that also come with that. So think about inclusion when we are working in a hybrid environment, create those opportunities for collaboration. You know, people need to come together now and again just to kind of to socially network. Think about how your colleagues are doing, how's their mental health and well-being, check in on your teams. You know, again, it's like, you know, let's think of the really positive benefits of that, but also be wary that to create a culture of inclusion, you know, we need to come together as people, and we need to kind of create that sense of understanding. So we've a real focus, that we call it growing, learning together. We've a real focus in the organization about talking to each other, listening to people's life experiences, valuing those life experiences, and kind of, you know, educating each other on things that, you know, we think would be helpful to them, you know. And I think that's us as humans, isn't it? You know, we learn best when we listen, and we know, but you know, how people have experienced things in life, creating that empathy. I think it's really important.
Yeah, and that's really, really interesting, isn't it? Because we have had that big barrier to it in many ways, not being physically able to meet with colleagues and collaborate. But and I think all of those things, you know, it's creating the opportunities, isn't it? And I guess creating I know in Beever and Struthers, we've been creating opportunities around equality, diversity and inclusion, and I've listened to colleagues telling us about their lives. When we went through EDI, several colleagues, we had colleagues fasting alongside our colleagues, and I think it did allow us all, whether you were taking an actual part in it or just being aware of it, it did allow us all to get more awareness and learn, and very much, even from some of us, some of the simple questions were, well, why does Eid last that long then? And when does it start and when does it finish? And very simple things, but now we all have an understanding. So I think that's really, really important. And I guess there's a question in the chat, and just looking at the time, because we're just about to get to the point of time where the session should close, albeit I know that for Manchester normally let us go on a little bit longer. And if colleagues can stay with us for a little while longer. So just a few minutes though, promise. But I guess if I just go around each of the panel, and I'll start with you, Tara, because you're still on screen with me. So the question is around, and I suppose going back to a question I asked earlier, for organizations, how do you, strike that balance about creating positive steps with actually still doing the day job? So I think the comment being that this architect organization, they've got they're proactive about their values and their strategy, but it does rely on some being enthusiastic, I guess, to make the change. And so I guess from that perspective, what comments do you have around that? And also, I guess your final top tips for anybody around the room. So something,
I guess you do get it. I think most of have said, there are people within the organisation who are, in terms of equality and diversity, because they're really passionate, and it's great to have those people, and to really kind of embrace that. And I think for me, I'm an EDI specialist, but I do need the support of my colleagues in terms of delivering what we need to do. And we've set up a champions programme as well, so we've got different champions for colleagues championing different areas of diversity and equality. So again, they will be a point of contact for colleagues to come to, some kind of guidance and support. So again, it's not just all reliant on kind of one team or one area. Actually, we're taking responsibility across the business for diversity and inclusion. I think that's a really key part. It's not just the job of the EDI specialist to make sure that we deliver our EDI strategy. Actually, it's the job of your leadership team and your board and your heads of service and your frontline managers and all your colleagues. So again, it's about making that part of their day-to-day role and that culture. So creating that culture of inclusion, we've got it as part of one of our kind of key cultural indicators is respect. How do we treat other people? How do we value other people? How can people be themselves? Make it part of your cultural framework and your cultural, how you operate as a business. It shouldn't be seen as something aside to your day job. It is part of our day-to-day activities, providing, fair, inclusive, equal services to our customers, and embracing, the talents that all our colleagues can bring. And we just need to think a little bit differently about how we do that sometimes. Top tips from me, let me think. For me, it's that kind of if you can engage your leadership team, I think that visibility piece is massive. Our chief executive throughout the pandemic did a weekly vlog every single week, sat down in front of a screen and did a vlog communication to our colleagues. And within that, he talked about equality, diversity, inclusion every week. He talked about issues around racism. He talked about the work that we're doing in terms of supporting some of our vulnerable communities during COVID, the increased impacts on kind of older people, social isolation for LGBT communities. If we can kind of get those conversations part and parcel of all our discussions, not just as something we talk about now and again. And I know that's kind of easy to say and probably quite difficult to do, but it is part of everything that we do if you sit and think about it. So again, leadership, visibility, keep the conversation going. It should be talked about regularly. Excellent. As part of what we do.
I love that, Tara. Thank you. So if I now move to Abdul. Abdul, I don't know whether you've got any further response to the question, anything different, and your final top tips?
Yeah, I think that it goes in line with the top tips in a sense to answer that question. I think for us, what's worked well is that embedding of the culture. So without repeating myself, in a sense, I think it needs to be that top-down approach. And I guess everyone's busy and everyone can see this as an additional task. And I'm talking about operational staff might feel that way, that we're pushing more and more work on them to kind of deliver some of these objectives. I guess we have to give this time. It's not about getting it right very, very quickly. Understanding some of the challenges and how the organization will deliver that. We set ourselves some milestones, and we feel that we need to address some of these issues that within the milestone itself before we go to the next one. And I guess people get very, very passionate about this area, and rightly so. But I guess it's almost trying to understand it and unravel it before almost walk before you can run with it. And I think that's where people won't feel overwhelmed. These are complicated issues, to be honest. It's not as simple as sometimes you think they are, in a sense. So where some organizations haven't focused on EDI, they've delivered on it but not necessarily focused on it as an objective. It takes a lot of cultural shift, to be honest, to get to that area. And I think for me, it's having that clear plan and that visibility of leadership promoting it. I see in a lot of organizations that, they talk about a lot of things, but not necessarily embedding their leadership team. So I think that would be my top tip in a sense is take the time, understand the challenges and almost have that phased approach rather than trying to deliver everything at once. EDI is not just one department, in a sense. It's not one individual that delivers, even if it's a specialist role. It's just like health and safety, to be honest. We have health and safety experts, but everyone's role is to make sure the health and safety is delivered at all levels. So, I just think it needs a wider thinking and a sensible approach to it.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Abdul. I like the clear plan approach, being a planner that I am. And then Shamila, I can come back to you, please.
I mean, for me, I think accountability is key. So, you're not going to shift culture or change things if people aren't held accountable for it. And it starts with the leadership team because they set the tone, the culture for an organization, and that filters through. And then the second thing for me is really listening to your people, your clients, your customers. Because for me, it's almost a no-brainer, really. There's the moral argument. We all know it's the right thing to do, but there's a business argument as well. And then, you take the legal bit, we have, there's legislation. But I think, that doesn't win hearts and minds. So for me, it's, thinking through the moral, legal and business case for why it's important. And, yes, I think having specialists in the organization helps because, then they can drive the strategy, but it has to be kind of owned by, particularly by the senior leadership team. So for me, accountability is key. And, because without accountability, you don't get, it becomes nobody's business then. So I think that would be my kind of top tip.
Yeah, that buy-in. I like that. I think, and then leading us and taking us through that leadership back to someone who operates at board level. I think, very much from my, and from my personal perspective, as well as from a professional perspective, I think it does, we've said it, top down culture and that engaging is what we're embracing. But Grenville, just to finally finish with yourself, please.
Yeah, I think for me, and I think Sean Miller was really bringing this out, for me, EDI is not an optional extra. It's about investing in your future sustainability and your future success, about your reputation as an employer and being able to attract the right employees with the right values. And I think we increasingly know people who are looking for jobs and leaving jobs. It is driven by the culture and the values of the organisation. So it is a must-do, like so many other things. In terms of top tips for myself, I mean, it's just constantly learning, listening, and challenging, and trying to do what you can do to shape the culture, and be prepared, as I've increasingly been prepared. Put your head up over the parapet and say what is obvious to you, even if nobody else is saying it, because that is what then drives the necessary change that we need in society and in our organisations.
Yeah, Just have that courage, isn't it? And I think for those leaders in the room, hopefully you're taking all of this on board. That's me included, and my colleague Helen, I think, in terms of, you know, what we do and within our organisations, and I think very much the cultural change. But for those that aren't leaders, and like, for instance, the question that was asked earlier, you know, if you're part of a team, you know, as Grenville says, challenge and get the questions out there. So from my perspective, and I think there are many go-to places as well, in terms of, clearly we can all Google, but many go-to places, anyone in the housing sector, obviously the National Housing Federation has got its EDI tool, and where it's collecting data nationally, which is quite interesting, but also some other helpful data and information out there as well. So I think we've gone over the hour. As always, it's been really, really interesting to hear what our panelists have got to say and help us with in terms of our thinking in this area, and some of those practical ideas and things that they've embraced and focused upon along the way so far. And I know you're all still on your journeys as well, and I wish you success. I hope to see you back around this table again, and maybe we can think about some more maybe focused topics we can talk about next time, if that's what our wider colleagues would like to hear. And just thank you all for your time and information, and thank you all for listening, those in the background.
Thanks very much, Sue. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all of our guest speakers today, and thanks to everyone for attending. I'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sean.